The wedding hall looked like something out of a dream. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling, glowing like tiny stars. White flowers covered every corner, and long tables were set with shining plates and crystal glasses. People walked around in beautiful clothes, laughing, talking, and taking pictures. The air was filled with music and the smell of fresh food. Everything felt perfect, almost like a movie scene. Guests from different places had come to celebrate this special day. Some were close family, others were important business people, and many were friends who had known the couple for years. Everyone seemed happy and relaxed, enjoying the moment without worry. Among all this beauty and joy, there was someone who moved quietly in the background. Her name was Aisha. She wore a simple black and white uniform, the same as the other waitresses. Her hair was tied neatly, and her face had a calm expression. She carried trays of drinks carefully, making sure nothing spilled. She walked from one table to another, serving guests politely, always with a soft, "Thank you," or "Here you go." Most people didn't notice her. To them, she was just part of the service, someone doing her job. Their eyes were focused on the decorations, the food, or their own conversations. Aisha had gotten used to this. It wasn't new for her. She had worked at many events before, and it was always the same. She stayed in the background, silent and unseen. But if someone looked closely, they might notice something different about her. There was a quiet depth in her eyes. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would pause for a second and look toward the stage where a grand piano stood. It was placed near the center of the hall, shining under the lights. It wasn't being used at the moment, but it added a touch of class to the event. Aisha would look at it for just a moment, then quickly turn away and continue her work. It was as if that piano meant something to her. But no one asked, and she never said anything. On the other side of the hall, a group of well-dressed guests stood together, laughing loudly. They held glasses in their hands and spoke with confidence. One man in particular stood out among them. He wore an expensive suit, and his voice was louder than the rest. He liked to joke, but his jokes often came at the cost of others. People around him laughed, even when they didn't fully find it funny. It was clear that he enjoyed being the center of attention. As the evening went on, he kept looking around the hall, observing people. His eyes moved from one guest to another, and then, slowly, they landed on Aisha. First, it was just a quick glance. Then another. Soon, he started paying more attention to her. He watched how she walked, how she kept her head slightly down, and how she avoided eye contact. There was something about her quiet nature that caught his interest, but not in a kind way. He smiled slightly, as if he had found something to entertain himself with. Meanwhile, Aisha continued her work, unaware that someone was watching her so closely. She carried a tray of drinks toward a table near the center. As she placed the glasses carefully, she heard laughter coming from behind her. She didn't turn around. She had learned not to react to every sound or comment. In places like this, it was better to stay focused and not get involved. Still, she could feel eyes on her. She picked up her empty tray and moved away, heading toward the service area. Her steps were steady, but her mind seemed distant for a moment. As she passed by the piano again, her eyes couldn't help but look at it once more. Memories flickered in her mind, but she quickly pushed them aside. This was not the place for that. This was work. In another corner of the hall, the music changed to something softer. A few guests moved toward the dance floor, while others stayed at their tables. The atmosphere grew warmer, more relaxed as the night continued. The man who had been watching Aisha took a sip from his glass and leaned slightly toward his friends. He said something quietly. They laughed. One of them glanced toward Aisha and shook his head, as if already understanding what kind of joke was coming next. The man's eyes followed Aisha again as she walked past them. This time, his smile grew wider. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that made others uncomfortable, even if they didn't say it out loud. Not far from them, an older woman noticed this. She watched the scene quietly, her expression serious. She didn't like what she was seeing, but she chose to stay silent for now. Aisha, still unaware of the full attention on her, continued serving guests. A child at one table asked her for juice, and she smiled gently while handing it over. The child smiled back, and for a brief moment, Aisha's face softened. Moments like these were rare, but they mattered. They reminded her that kindness still existed, even in small ways. As the night moved forward, the hall became even more lively. The sound of laughter, music, and conversation filled every corner. Waiters and waitresses moved quickly, making sure everything was running smoothly. Aisha worked without pause. But inside her, there was a quiet storm. Not because of anything happening at that moment, but because of everything she carried within. Her life had not been easy. There were dreams she had once held close, dreams that now felt far away. Still, she never complained. She simply moved forward one step at a time. The man in the suit placed his empty glass on a table and straightened his jacket. He looked toward the piano, then back at Aisha. An idea seemed to form in his mind. He chuckled softly. His friends noticed the change in his expression. "Now what?" one of them asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he just said, "Watch." There was a tone in his voice that made it clear something was about to happen. Something unnecessary. Something that could change the mood of the evening. Aisha walked past them again, holding a tray of fresh drinks. As she moved, she felt a strange tension in the air, like something was about to unfold. But she kept going, because that's what she always did. She kept going no matter what. The golden lights still shined, the music still played, and the wedding still looked perfect on the outside. But sometimes, in the middle of beautiful moments, something unexpected begins to grow, and no one realizes it until it's already too late. The music in the hall grew louder as the night moved forward. More guests had gathered near the center, some talking, some laughing, and a few slowly making their way to the dance floor. The atmosphere felt warm and full of life, but underneath all that joy, something uncomfortable was quietly building. Aisha stepped out of the service area again, holding a tray filled with fresh drinks. Her hands were steady, her steps careful. She had learned how to move through crowds without drawing attention. It was almost like she knew how to become invisible when needed. As she walked past the group of well-dressed men, she felt it again, that same feeling of being watched. This time she couldn't ignore it. Before she could move past them, a voice stopped her. "Hey you!" It was the man in the expensive suit. His tone wasn't polite. It wasn't even neutral. It carried a slight edge, like he was already amused before saying anything else. Aisha paused. Slowly, she turned toward him, keeping her expression calm. "Yes, sir?" she said softly. The men around him smirked, already expecting something entertaining. The man looked at the tray in her hands, then at her face. "You've been walking around all night," he said. "Don't you get tired?" Aisha gave a small, respectful nod. "It's part of the job, sir." He let out a short laugh. "Of course it is." There was a pause. For a moment, it seemed like the conversation would end there. But it didn't. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound like he was sharing something funny with his group. "Tell me something," he said. "Do you do anything else? Or just carry trays?" Aisha didn't answer immediately. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her. This wasn't a simple question. It was something else, something meant to test her or maybe make her uncomfortable. Still, she stayed calm. "I work here, sir," she replied. One of the men chuckled. Another took a sip of his drink, watching closely. The man in the suit tilted his head slightly. He said, pretending to think. Then his eyes shifted toward the piano. A slow smile appeared on his face. "What about that?" he said, pointing toward it. "Can you play?" A few people nearby turned their heads. The question caught their attention. Aisha followed his gaze and saw the piano again. For a second, her heart skipped. She hadn't expected that. The man continued, his voice now louder so others could hear. "You look like someone who might have hidden talents." His friends laughed quietly. Aisha's grip on the tray tightened just a little. "I don't," she started, but stopped. The man raised his eyebrows. "What? You don't know how?" he said, pretending to be surprised. "That's a shame. I thought maybe you'd surprise us." More laughter. A few guests who had been standing nearby were now fully watching. Some of them smiled awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Others looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. Aisha felt her face grow slightly warm. This wasn't new to her. Being questioned, being looked down on. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the number of people watching. Maybe it was the way he spoke, like she was just a source of entertainment. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly. "I should continue my work." She tried to step away, but his voice stopped her again. "Wait." This time it was firmer. She paused once more. "Why so serious?" he said with a small laugh. "We're just having a little fun, right? Everyone." A few people forced a laugh. Others said nothing. He took a step forward, now clearly enjoying the attention. "Come on," he said. "It's a wedding, a happy event. Let's make it more interesting." He pointed toward the piano again. "Go on. Play something." The words hung in the air. Aisha felt her chest tighten. She looked around. Some guests avoided eye contact. Some watched with curiosity. A few seemed to feel sorry for her, but no one stepped in. The older woman from earlier was still there. She frowned slightly, clearly not pleased, but she remained quiet. Aisha looked back at the man. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said gently. "Why not?" he replied quickly. "Afraid you'll make a mistake?" His tone had changed now. It was sharper, more direct. "No one will mind," he added, waving his hand casually. "In fact, I think everyone would enjoy it." One of his friends spoke up. "Yeah, go on. It'll be fun." More soft laughter followed. Aisha's mind felt crowded. Part of her wanted to walk away, to ignore everything and continue working. That would be the easiest choice. But another part of her felt something else. Something deeper. The piano stood there, quiet and still, almost waiting. She had spent the whole evening avoiding it, avoiding the memories attached to it. But now it was right in front of her, impossible to ignore. The man noticed her hesitation and smiled again. "See?" he said. "She's thinking about it." He turned to the others. "Maybe she does know something after all." The crowd around them had grown slightly bigger now. People were curious. Some whispered to each other, wondering what would happen next. Aisha took a slow breath. Her hands were still holding the tray, but her grip had softened. "I really should get back to work," she said again. Her voice calm but quieter now. The man sighed dramatically. "You're no fun," he said. Then, after a short pause, he added, "Or maybe, you just don't have the courage." That sentence landed heavily. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The older woman crossed her arms, clearly unhappy now. Aisha felt something change inside her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. She slowly placed the tray on a nearby table. The small sound of the glasses touching the surface seemed louder than it should have been. The man raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Well," he said, a grin forming on his face. "Look at that." Aisha looked at him for a brief moment. Then, without saying anything, she turned toward the piano. The room seemed to grow quieter. Guests nearby began to notice what was happening. Conversations slowed down. Some people stepped closer, curious. The man leaned back slightly, clearly pleased with himself. "Now this," he said to his friends, "is going to be interesting." Aisha walked slowly. Each step felt heavy, but steady. Her heart was beating faster now, but her face remained calm. As she reached the piano, she stopped for a moment. Her fingers hovered slightly above the surface. It had been a long time, a very long time. Behind her, the soft sounds of whispers filled the air. What's she doing? Does she actually know how to play? This is going to be awkward. The man folded his arms, watching closely. He was expecting something. Something funny. Something embarrassing. Something that would give him another reason to laugh. But Aisha wasn't thinking about him anymore. For the first time that night, she wasn't thinking about the guests, the job, or the pressure. She was only thinking about the piano. Slowly, she pulled out the chair and sat down. Her hands rested gently on her lap. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes. The hall was no longer just a wedding venue. Felt like something else. Something familiar. Something from her past. The noise around her faded, even though people were still there. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes. The room waited. Everyone watched. And the moment before the first note felt longer than anything else that night. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Aisha sat still in front of the piano, her hands resting gently on her lap. The hall, which had been full of noise just moments ago, slowly became quiet. Conversations faded, laughter stopped, and even the music in the background seemed to lose its presence. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Behind her, a small crowd had formed. Some people stood with curiosity, some with doubt, and a few with quiet concern. They didn't know what to expect. To them, she was just a waitress who had been pushed into a situation she probably couldn't handle. The man who had challenged her stood with his arms crossed, a confident smile still on his face. He leaned slightly toward his friends and whispered something, making them chuckle again. In his mind, this was still a joke, still a moment for his own entertainment. But Aisha didn't turn around. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. Her focus stayed on the piano. Her fingers slowly moved from her lap to the keys. They hovered just above them, not touching yet. There was a slight tremble in her hands, but it wasn't from fear alone. It was something deeper, something connected to memories she had kept buried for a long time. She closed her eyes again. In that moment, the wedding hall faded away. The lights, the people, the noise, everything felt distant. Instead, her mind took her somewhere else. A small room, a simple piano, soft sunlight coming through a window, and a younger version of herself, sitting just like this, learning, practicing, dreaming. Her fingers had once moved across keys every day, full of hope and passion. Music had not just been a hobby for her. It had been a part of her identity, something that made her feel alive. But life had changed. Responsibilities had come. Dreams had been left behind. And the piano had slowly become a memory. Aisha opened her eyes. She was back in the present. Back in the hall. Back in front of all those people. Her fingers lowered slightly. And then, the first note played. It was soft. So soft that some people almost didn't hear it. But it was enough. The sound was clear, pure and steady. A few heads tilted. The man in the suit raised his eyebrows just a little, surprised that she had actually started. Aisha pressed another key. Then another. The notes began to form a simple melody. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. But it was controlled. Each note flowed into the next, like a quiet conversation. The room grew even more silent. People who had been whispering stopped completely now. The sound of the piano slowly filled the space, reaching every corner of the hall. Aisha's hands began to relax. The slight tremble faded. Her fingers moved more freely now, more confidently. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply playing. And that made all the difference. The melody grew deeper, more emotional. There was something in the way she played that felt real, something that couldn't be faked. It wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about feeling them. A woman standing near the front placed her hand gently over her chest, her expression changing. A man who had been checking his phone slowly lowered it, his attention now fully on the piano. Even the waiters and waitresses in the background paused for a moment, watching quietly. The man who had started all this shifted his stance. The smile on his face began to fade. This wasn't what he had expected. Not at all. Aisha's fingers moved faster now. The melody changed. It became stronger, more powerful. There was a rise in the music, a sense of emotion building with each passing second. Felt like she was telling a story without using any words. A story of struggle, of silence, of something lost and something still alive. Her face remained calm, but her eyes held a quiet intensity. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She wasn't looking at the man. She was looking at the keys, fully focused, completely lost in the moment. The room was no longer just watching. They were listening. Truly listening. The older woman from earlier stepped a little closer, her expression now soft and thoughtful. She could see it clearly. This wasn't just a random moment. This was something meaningful. A child who had been playing nearby stopped and stood still, watching with wide eyes. The music continued to grow. It reached a point where it filled the entire hall, wrapping around everyone present. There was no laughter now, no whispering, no judgment, only silence and sound. The man in the suit slowly uncrossed his arms. His expression had changed completely. There was no confidence left in his posture, no sign of amusement. Instead, there was confusion, and something else. Something he wasn't used to feeling in situations like this. He looked around. Other guests were focused on Aisha, completely drawn into her performance. No one was looking at him anymore. For the first time that night, he wasn't the center of attention. And he didn't know how to react. Aisha's playing became softer again. The strong notes faded into gentle ones, like a wave slowly calming after a storm. Her fingers slowed down. Each note now carried a quiet weight, like a whisper that held meaning. The emotion in the room shifted. It wasn't just surprise anymore. It was something deeper. Respect. Understanding. Even those who didn't know anything about music could feel it. Because it wasn't just music. It was her. Her story. Her feelings. Her truth. As the final part of the melody approached, the room remained completely still. No one wanted to break the moment. No one wanted it to end. Aisha pressed the last few keys gently. The final note echoed softly. And then, silence. Real silence. Not the kind filled with whispers or background noise, but the kind that stays for a few seconds after something truly powerful happens. Aisha's hands rested on the keys for a moment longer. Then slowly, she lifted them. She took a small breath and sat still. Behind her, the room remained frozen, as if everyone needed a moment to understand what they had just witnessed. The man in the suit stood quietly. No words, no laughter, nothing, because whatever he had expected from this moment, this wasn't it. Not even close. For a few long seconds after the last note, no one moved. Felt like time had stopped inside the hall. Aisha kept sitting quietly at the piano, her hands now resting gently in her lap. Her breathing was slow, but inside, her heart was still beating fast. She could feel it in her chest, strong and loud, like it had been waiting for this moment for years. Behind her, the silence slowly began to break. Not with words, but with a single sound. Clap. Came from somewhere near the front. Soft, unsure at first. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire hall filled with applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't forced. It was real. People stood up from their seats. Some smiled, some looked emotional, and a few even shook their heads in disbelief. The same guests who had been laughing earlier were now clapping the loudest, as if trying to make up for what had happened before. Aisha blinked slowly. She wasn't expecting this. She hadn't played for applause. She had only played because something inside her told her to. But now, as the sound of clapping filled the room, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt seen. Not as a waitress. Not as someone in the background. But as herself. She slowly stood up from the piano. Her movements were simple, calm, and quiet, just like always. But something about her felt different now. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. She turned around to face the crowd. For a moment, her eyes moved across the room. People were still clapping. Some nodded at her with respect. Others gave her soft smiles. Even those who had stayed silent before now seemed to recognize her in a new way. Near the front, the older woman who had been watching all along placed her hand over her heart and smiled warmly. Her eyes held a sense of pride. Even though she didn't know Aisha personally, Aisha gave a small nod in return. Not a bow. Not a grand gesture. Just a simple acknowledgement. The applause slowly began to fade, but the feeling in the room stayed. It was no longer just a wedding celebration. Something had changed. The energy felt different, more human, more aware. In the middle of the crowd, the man in the expensive suit stood still, completely still. His face no longer held that confident smile. Instead, there was a quiet tension in his expression. He looked at Aisha, but this time not with amusement, with something else, something heavier. His friends, who had been laughing earlier, were silent now. One of them looked down at his glass, avoiding eye contact. Another cleared his throat, unsure of what to say. The man shifted slightly. For the first time that night, he looked uncomfortable. Aisha's eyes met his for a brief moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. There was no anger in her expression. No pride, just calmness. And that made it even harder for him to respond. He opened his mouth slightly, as if he wanted to say something. But no words came out. Because what could he say? Moments ago, he had turned her into a joke. Now, she had turned that moment into something no one would forget. Aisha broke the eye contact first. She didn't wait for anything. She simply stepped away from the piano. As she walked back toward the service area, the crowd slowly made space for her. People moved aside without being asked, their eyes following her quietly. A young woman standing near the aisle whispered to her friend, "I didn't expect that." Her friend nodded. No one did. Another guest said softly, "She plays better than professionals." These whispers weren't loud, but they carried respect. Real respect. Aisha walked past them, her step steady. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. When she reached the table where she had left her tray, she picked it up again. The glasses were still there, untouched. For a second, she looked at them. Then she let out a small breath and continued her work, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. In the background, the music slowly started again, but it felt different now. It no longer dominated the room. Instead, it stayed soft, almost like it didn't want to interrupt the feeling that still lingered. The older woman walked toward one of the event organizers and said something quietly. Her tone was serious, but kind. The organizer nodded, looking toward Aisha with a new sense of attention. Across the hall, the man in the suit finally moved. He took a step forward. Then another. His friends watched him, unsure of what he was about to do. He walked in the direction Aisha had gone. But his steps were slower now, careful, as if he was thinking about each one. Aisha was placing drinks on a table when she noticed him approaching. She didn't react immediately. She simply continued her work. He stopped a few steps away from her. For a moment he said nothing. The silence between them felt heavier than before. Then finally he spoke. His voice was different now. Lower, quieter. "I didn't know," he said. Aisha looked up at him. Her expression remained calm. She didn't respond right away. He shifted slightly, clearly unsure of himself. "I mean," he continued, "I didn't expect." He stopped again. The words weren't coming easily, because this wasn't like before. Before, he had been in control of the situation. Now he wasn't. Aisha gently placed the last glass on the table. Then she turned fully toward him. "It's okay," she said softly. Just two simple words. But they carried more meaning than anything else he had said. He looked at her, surprised. "Okay?" he repeated, almost confused. She gave a small nod. Yes. There was no sarcasm. No hidden tone. Just honesty. That made it even harder for him to respond. He looked down for a moment, then back at her. "I was just joking," he said. But even he seemed unsure of his own words now. Aisha didn't argue. She didn't correct him. She simply said, "Sometimes jokes can hurt." Her voice was still calm, but the truth in her words was clear. The man stayed silent, because he knew she was right. Around them, the wedding continued. People returned to their conversations, the music played, and the celebration moved on. But the moment that had just happened stayed in the air. It stayed in people's minds. And most of all, it stayed with him. Aisha picked up her tray again. "Excuse me," she said politely, and stepped past him. He moved aside without thinking, watching her walk away, this time not as a source of entertainment, but as someone he didn't fully understand yet, someone he had judged too quickly. and someone who had just shown him a side of life he had never taken the time to see before. The golden lights still shined. The hall was still beautiful. But now there was something more in that space. Something deeper than decoration. A quiet reminder that people are never as simple as they seem. The wedding slowly returned to its rhythm, but nothing felt exactly the same anymore. The music played again, guests continued talking, and laughter came back into the air. But there was a new awareness in the room. People who had once been focused only on themselves were now more observant, more thoughtful. Every now and then, someone would glance toward Aisha, as if trying to understand her better. Aisha continued her work like always. She carried trays, served drinks, and moved from one table to another. On the outside, she looked exactly the same, calm, quiet, focused. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a small sense of release. Like a door she had kept closed for a long time had opened, even if just a little. At one table, a middle-aged couple stopped her as she placed glasses in front of them. "You played beautifully," the woman said softly. Her voice was kind, not loud enough to draw attention. Aisha paused for a moment, slightly surprised. She wasn't used to guests speaking to her like this. "Thank you," she replied gently. The man beside the woman nodded. "You have real talent," he added. "Have you learned professionally?" Aisha hesitated for a second. There were many ways she could answer that question, but she chose the simplest one. "I used to learn," she said. The couple exchanged a quick glance, as if they understood there was more behind those words. "You should not stop," the woman said, her tone warm. "Some things are too special to leave behind." Aisha gave a small smile, then moved on. A few steps away, another guest stopped her. Then another. Each one said something similar. "Your music was touching. I didn't expect that at all. You have a gift." These weren't loud compliments meant to show off. They were quiet, honest words, and each one reached her in a different way. She didn't respond much. Just a nod, a soft thank you, and then back to work. But inside, she heard every word. Near the center of the hall, the older woman who had been watching everything stood speaking to one of the event organizers again. Her expression was serious but calm, like someone who had made a decision. "Call her for a moment," she said quietly. The organizer nodded and looked around until he spotted Aisha. He walked toward her and gently said, "Excuse me, someone would like to speak with you." Aisha looked slightly confused but followed him. As she approached, the older woman turned toward her with a gentle smile. "You played the piano earlier," she said. It wasn't a question. Aisha nodded. "Yes." The woman stepped a little closer. "That was not something small," she said. "That was something people remember." Aisha stayed quiet. "I have attended many events," the woman continued, "and I have heard many performances. But what you did, it felt real." There was a pause. The woman studied her face, as if trying to read her story without asking too many questions. "Why did you stop?" she asked softly. The question was simple, but it carried weight. Aisha looked down for a moment. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray she was holding. "Life," she said after a short pause. Just one word, but it explained everything. The woman nodded slowly. She didn't push further. "Life does that sometimes," she said. "But it doesn't mean it's the end." Aisha looked up again. There was something sincere in the woman's eyes. Something that made her feel understood, even without long explanations. "If you ever get the chance again," the woman added, "don't turn away from it." Aisha didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. The woman smiled, then stepped back. "Go," she said gently. "Your work is waiting." Aisha returned to her duties, but the conversation stayed with her. Not far from there, the man in the suit stood alone now. His friends had moved back into the crowd, trying to return to normal, but he hadn't followed them. He stood still, holding a glass he hadn't touched in a while. His mind was not on the wedding anymore. It was on what had happened, and more importantly, on how he had acted. He replayed the moment again and again. The way he had called her, the The way he had spoken, the laughter, and then, the music. He let out a slow breath. For the first time in a long time he felt something close to regret. Not because someone had corrected him. Not because someone had forced him to apologize. But because he had seen the result of his own actions. And it didn't sit well with him. He looked across the hall and saw Aisha again, moving quietly as before. But now he saw her differently. Not as a waitress, but as someone with a story he didn't know. Someone he had judged without thinking. He placed his glass down and started walking toward her again. This time there was no audience. No laughter. No show. Just him. And his thoughts. Aisha was near the side of the hall, arranging glasses on a table when she noticed him approaching again. She paused slightly but didn't step back. He stopped in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Can I say something?" His voice was calm, different from before. Aisha looked at him and nodded. "Yes." He took a small breath. "I was wrong," he said. There was no hesitation this time. No joking tone. Just honesty. "I didn't think before speaking," he continued. "I didn't try to understand. I just acted." Aisha listened quietly. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were simple, but they were real. Aisha looked at him for a moment. She could see the difference now. Not just in his words, but in his expression. People can pretend. But this didn't feel like that. She gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said. He seemed slightly surprised by her response. Maybe he expected anger, or silence. But she had chosen something else. Something calm. "I hope I didn't make things harder for you," he added. Aisha shook her head gently. "It's okay," she said again. There was no bitterness in her voice, and that made him feel even more humbled. He gave a small nod in return. Then, without saying anything more, he stepped aside. Not because he had nothing left to say, but because he understood something important now. Not every moment needs more words. Sometimes understanding is enough. Aisha picked up her tray and continued her work. But this time, when she walked through the hall, something was different. People noticed her. Not in a loud way. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable. But in a quiet, respectful way. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. The wedding continued. The lights still shined. The music still played. But beneath all that, a small change had taken place. A change in how people saw one another. And sometimes, that is where the real story begins. The night slowly moved toward its end. But the feeling in the hall stayed warm and thoughtful. The music was softer now, and many guests had taken their seats again, enjoying the last part of the celebration. Some people were tired, some were still smiling, and others seemed lost in their own thoughts. Aisha continued her work, just like she had been doing since the beginning of the evening. She walked from one table to another, collecting empty glasses, adjusting plates, and making sure everything looked neat. On the outside, it seemed like nothing had changed for her. She was still the same quiet waitress, doing her job with care. But inside, something had settled. Not excitement, not pride, just a calm feeling, like a weight she had been carrying had become lighter. As she moved past the piano again, she slowed down for a second. It stood there, just as before, shining softly under the lights. No one was gathered around it now. No one was watching. It was quiet. Aisha looked at it for a moment longer than usual. This time, her eyes didn't carry hesitation. They carried something softer, something closer to acceptance. Then she gently looked away and continued walking. Near the main table, the bride and groom were sitting together, smiling as they spoke to their guests. Someone leaned in and said something to them, and both of them turned their heads toward Aisha. The bride watched her for a moment. "Is that her?" she asked quietly. The guest nodded. "Yes, the one who played earlier." The groom looked curious. "I missed it," he said. "Was it really that good?" The guest smiled slightly. "You have no idea." The bride stood up. Without making a scene, she walked toward Aisha. Aisha was adjusting a tablecloth when she noticed someone standing in front of her. She looked up and was surprised to see the bride. For a second, she wasn't sure how to react. "Are you the one who played the piano?" the bride asked gently. Aisha nodded. "Yes." The bride smiled warmly. "I wish I had heard it properly," she said. "Everyone is talking about it." Aisha didn't know what to say, so she simply gave a small, polite smile. "It must have been a special moment," the bride continued. "Thank you for adding something beautiful to our day." Those words felt different. They weren't just about skill. They were about meaning. Aisha lowered her eyes slightly. "Thank you," she said softly. The bride hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you don't mind, would you like to play again? Just for a minute." Aisha looked up, surprised. Around them, a few nearby guests turned their heads, curious. This wasn't planned. This wasn't pressure. This was a choice. Aisha glanced toward the piano again, then back at the bride. There was kindness in her expression, not expectation. Aisha thought for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "Yes," she said. The bride smiled and gently stepped aside. This time, there was no loud announcement, no teasing, no challenge, just quiet curiosity. A few people noticed and began to gather again, but the mood was completely different now. It was calm, respectful, and sincere. Aisha walked toward the piano once more. Her steps were lighter this time, not because she was less nervous, but because she was no longer carrying the same weight. She reached the piano and sat down. The room slowly quieted again, but this silence felt different from before. It wasn't filled with doubt. It was filled with anticipation. Aisha placed her fingers on the keys. She didn't close her eyes this time. She didn't look at the crowd either. She simply focused on the moment. Then she began to play. The melody was softer than before, gentler. It didn't rise quickly or try to impress. It flowed slowly, like a calm stream. Each note felt peaceful, clear, honest. People listened quietly. Some smiled. Some closed their eyes. Others simply stood still, letting the music settle around them. The bride stood near the front, her expression calm and happy. The groom joined her, placing his hand gently in hers. Even the man who had started everything stood at a distance, watching silently. There was no tension in his face now, only quiet attention. Aisha continued playing, her fingers moving naturally. This time, there was no pressure behind her music. No past pulling at her. No need to prove anything. She was simply playing because she wanted to, and that made the music feel even more real. As the melody reached its end, it didn't stop suddenly. It faded slowly, like the last light of the evening. The final note lingered softly in the air. And then, silence again. But this silence felt peaceful. A small smile appeared on Aisha's face. Just for a moment. Then she stood up. The applause came again, but this time it was softer, gentler, more personal. Not as loud as before, but somehow deeper. Aisha gave a small nod, then stepped away from the piano. The bride walked toward her and said, "That was beautiful." "Thank you," Aisha replied. This time her voice carried a little more warmth. As the night came closer to its end, guests slowly began to leave. Some said their goodbyes, others took final pictures, and the hall started to grow quieter. Aisha and the rest of the staff began cleaning up. Tables were cleared, decorations were adjusted, and the bright energy of the wedding slowly softened into stillness. The man in the suit passed by her one last time. He paused for a second. Then he gave a small nod. A simple gesture, but it carried respect. Aisha returned the nod. No words were needed. As the final guests left and the lights began to dim, Aisha stepped outside for a moment. The night air was cool and calm. She took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, her mind felt quiet. Not empty, just peaceful. She looked up at the sky. There were no bright lights here, no noise, no crowd. Just silence and space. She thought about the evening, about everything that had happened. The laughter, the challenge, the music, the change. It all felt real. And somehow it all felt important. Not because it changed her life completely, but because it reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. a part of herself that still existed, a part that hadn't disappeared. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back inside. There was still work to do. Life would continue as it always had. But now something was different. Not in the world around her, but within her. And sometimes, that is where the biggest change begins.